Okay, we're coming near the end of our summer series, and we've been looking at the sacred ordinary. What does it mean to follow Jesus more than just 1 hour per week as we come for Sunday service? And so what about the other 167 hours in the week? What does it look like to be a disciple of Jesus in the mundane, in the ordinary stuff of life? And so hopefully this has been an encouragement. We can't cover every aspect of life, obviously, so hopefully this is a starter set that you can begin to explore that. I have this book in my office that my mentor and teacher, Paul Stevens, helped to partly author and also assemble. It's a huge book, and it's called The Complete Book of Everyday Christianity. And if you ever want to borrow it or find it online, I will send you a link. It's fascinating because what it does is it forces us to be intentional theologically about the ordinary things in our lives. So it's not just grocery shopping and paying the bills and caring for our family and going for walks with the dog. These things are infused with God's presence. And so what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus in the ordinary? And so if you're interested in that book, you can either borrow my giant brick of a book, or I can give you the digital copy, because that's the intention of this series. Just to get us started thinking about what does it mean to be intentional in our journey with Christ in the mundane. Today we're going to revisit Mary and Martha and Jesus. We did that last week a little bit, and we're going to be reading from Luke chapter 10, and just a short passage, verses 38 to 42. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Martha's so bold in the way she talks to Jesus, right? "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." A beautiful snapshot into this remarkable friendship that Jesus had with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and we've come back to visit it again. So we've been spending this summer looking over the sacred ordinary, and I want to do a quick recap just to refresh our mind of what we've covered so far, and perhaps you're here for the very first time and wondering where we've been in our journey. So first of all, we have looked at food, right? And we've discovered the bottom line is that whether we eat or whether we drink, we do it all for the glory of God. That even something as ordinary as eating and drinking can become an act of worship. I don't know about you, and maybe it's just when I preach, I preach to myself first. And so all the meals since that sermon, we've been very intentional about just giving thanks before the meal. I mean, we've done it for years, but sometimes it becomes very routine. And so now we've just been pausing and just saying, "Lord, thank you for the food that we have." Even that simple expression becomes an act of worship. It becomes intentional, and it's the way that we follow Jesus with our food. And so that's one of the invitations that we've had and we've looked at together. Second thing we looked at, work. And we expanded the definition of work to make sure that we understand that it's not just the thing we do for pay, but it's this expenditure of energy, whether it's mental or physical or both, that's done in the service of others to build up the community and for the glory of God. This is the bigger aspect of work. And Colossians sums it up for us. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for human masters. The bottom line is our work matters. The things that we do in the flesh matters to God. The ordinary things can actually become an act of service to him. And that's how we want to expand our understanding and be intentional with our work. And then last week we looked at friendship, right? And I made fun of Doug. I'll try and withhold my sparring with Doug in the back row. People are wondering, who is this Doug guy? If you're new here and your name is Doug, it's not you. It's okay. We looked at friendship. And we discovered this: greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And we don't do it to the same extent that Jesus did for us. Jesus literally laid down his life for us, and most of us will not have that opportunity to do for someone else. Maybe some will, but not normally. But we do lay down something of ourselves in order to take up friendship. And so friendship becomes sacred when we learn not to simply look for good friends, but actually to become a good friend to someone else, and that requires sacrifice. So food, work, friendship, ordinary things, but none of them are spiritually neutral. And that's what I want to get across. None of these things are spiritually neutral. We have decisions whether we do these things for God's glory and honor or do it for our own selfish purposes in everything that we do. And so that's what we're looking at. Today, we come to something else that's very ordinary, and I think you will relate to this. I certainly do. The word is distraction. At this point, I'd ask you all to take out your cell phones and put them on silent, or unless you're reading your Bible or using the translation app. Distraction is very much part of our lives, right? It's a very ordinary thing. It's something that we encounter all the time. We read in Luke chapter 10, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. And later on, what do we find out about Martha? She was distracted with many things. And I think we are going to be able to identify with Martha. How do we approach this story? It's hopefully a familiar story to you and somewhat. How do we approach it? Because I think there's some mistakes that we can make when we approach the story about Martha and Mary. Here's the thing that I want to avoid. Don't make Martha the villain. Don't make Martha the villain. Martha is not the unspiritual sister. And so that's the first thing I really want to say. It's one of these Bible stories that is so familiar that we can have the tendency to reduce it to a stereotype, right? Martha's the busy one. Mary's the spiritual one. Martha is running around with a towel over her shoulder while Mary sits quietly at the feet of Jesus, right? And then we divide ourselves according to personality types. Anytime I mention Mary and Martha, inevitably I have people come up and say to me, I'm such a Martha, right? Some of you are thinking it right now. I know you are. Or, yeah, she's such a Mary. She's such a Mary. And I'm not sure entirely what we mean by that. I'm going to ask you to resist that temptation, because this story isn't about personality types. It's not the way we're meant to get ourselves behind one or the other, right? It's not a contrast between these two personalities. It's also not a contrast between the active Christian life and the contemplative Christian life, as if one is meant to be preferred over the other, right? It's not that Jesus wants us to stop working and spend all of our days sitting quietly contemplating the gospel. That's not what this is about. So these are the things that I want to avoid as we come to this. Martha is not the unspiritual sister. In fact, if you remember from last week, if you were here, when we read in John chapter 11 about Martha, we discover actually she is a theologian of the highest caliber. And I don't say that lightly. Martha has one of the most remarkable theological conversations with Jesus in the Gospels. When she comes out to him and talks with him, she makes this statement: I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. That's at the level of Peter. That's equal to Peter in his statements, right? Martha is no slouch spiritually. She is a theologian. This is hardly the confession of someone who doesn't understand or love or appreciate or know Jesus. And also, notice how this whole story begins. How does it begin? Martha opened her home to Jesus. It's her home. There's status here. There's theological aptitude. Martha is a remarkable, remarkable woman. This whole story came about because Martha opened the door to Jesus, which is amazing. So Martha is doing exactly what a faithful Jewish host is expected to do. Jesus is traveling with his disciples, and they needed some food and somewhere to stay, and Martha met that need. She's doing exactly what is right. So here's what I want to say about Martha. What Martha is doing is good, necessary, and hospitable. And that's what makes this story so important to each and every one of us. Because sometimes our greatest distractions aren't bad things. Sometimes good things distract us from the best thing. And that's part of the lesson of Martha that we want to dig into. Well, let's turn our attention to Mary just for a moment. It's two sisters. We don't want to put one against the other, but we want to just put the spotlight on them to understand where they're coming from. Mary is at the feet of Jesus. And she's not just there as some fangirl adoring Jesus, asking for his autograph, right? Mary has incredible depth to her as well. Luke tells us she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. This is really important. Mary isn't simply chilling out. She's not simply relaxing while Martha does all the work. To sit at someone's feet is a very specific expression. It's the expression of a posture of a disciple learning from a rabbi. This is incredibly important. And Paul, he uses almost the exact same language when he talks about his high profile education. He says, I sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He sat at the feet of the rabbi, right? This is a very important thing. Mary is taking the posture and the place of a disciple. And that might have been surprising to some, maybe even to some in that very room, because we shouldn't imagine that Jesus is simply there with Mary and Martha and maybe Lazarus kicking around somewhere. He's there with all of his disciples. And it's quite possible that Mary was sitting among the men, sitting at the feet of Jesus in the posture associated traditionally with a male disciple. This is really quite remarkable as we get through the story. And here's the thing. Jesus welcomes her there. He doesn't send her back to the kitchen, right? Isn't that so amazing? Jesus doesn't send Mary back to the kitchen. Go do the woman's work, says Jesus. Never. He doesn't tell her that discipleship belongs to the men while hospitality belongs to the women. Mary belongs at the feet of Jesus too, and that's a big part of the story. Again, though, Jesus' concern isn't simply where Mary is sitting, it's what has her attention. And this is where the story is driving us. She is listening to what he said. Mary is present, attentive, and listening. Quite possibly, Jesus was in the middle of a special teaching time that he often did with his disciples. Mary recognizes this, and she sits at his feet and is attentive to him. So she is attentive. Well, at the same time, poor Martha is pulled in many different directions. Luke tells us, but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. And that word distracted is really important. It only occurs once in the whole New Testament, right here. This is the only time that this word is used. And the idea in Greek is that this word distracted means being pulled apart or dragged away or drawn in many different directions at once. Can you identify with that? You ever feel that way, that kind of distraction where you're pulled away, where you're pulled apart in many different directions at once? The text doesn't say that Martha was doing something wrong. It says that while she was doing something good, her attention was being pulled away from Jesus. And eventually, she's had enough. What does she say? Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And you can hear that frustration kind of building up in her. Notice that Martha isn't actually asking Jesus a question here. She tells Jesus what the problem is. She tells Jesus who is responsible. And then she tells Jesus what to do about it. It sounds like my prayer life sometimes, right? You ever feel that? You go to God and you say, here's the problem, here's who's responsible, here's what you need to do, amen. It's true. And this is what happens with Martha. Distraction can become frustration. And Jesus, how does he respond to her? He says, Martha, Martha. And that repetition really matters. This isn't an angry rebuke. This is a gentle correction. Throughout Scripture, saying someone's name twice often communicates that kind of tenderness and concern. Abraham, Abraham, Samuel, Samuel, Simon, Simon, Martha, Martha. It's a very endearing kind of term. Jesus cares deeply about Martha's soul. And he sees that right now she's being pulled apart in many directions. Jesus sees her and he says this, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. So these three words are really important. Distraction, we've already talked about, pulled in many different directions, but then it's the two other descriptive words that describe what's happening in Martha's heart. She's worried. The Greek word means anxious, preoccupied, divided and consumed by cares. She's worried. And then she's also upset, troubled, agitated, disturbed, and maybe just a little bit jealous. Right? That's what happens when we become distracted in this way. It moves to frustration. It moves to being anxious. It moves to being disturbed and maybe a little bit jealous. This is a bad path that Martha is on. Pulled, worried, agitated. I think that maybe describes my life and maybe your life more than we care to admit. But that's the problem that we face. The problem, though, isn't busyness. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, Martha, stop serving. He doesn't say, Martha, meals don't matter. He doesn't say, Martha, responsible people aren't spiritual people, right? Here's the issue. The problem isn't necessarily what Martha is doing. The problem is what Martha's serving is doing to Martha. She is serving Jesus while becoming increasingly disconnected from Jesus, and that, in fact, can happen really easily. We can become very busy with doing lots of good things, and just take a moment to think of all the good things that you are called upon to do this week. We can provide for our families and lose sight of Jesus. We can build careers and lose sight of Jesus. We can care for aging parents and lose sight of Jesus. We can raise children and lose sight of Jesus. We can maintain our homes, volunteer in communities, answer emails, attend meetings, even meet deadlines and lose sight of Jesus. Do you get the idea? We can do good things and lose sight of the one thing. We can easily lose sight of Jesus. We can even lead ministries. We can even be active in the church. We can even prepare sermons. Do you know that? We can prepare sermons and lose sight of Jesus. It happens. We can teach classes and run programs and organize events and care for people and attend meetings and be so consumed with doing things for Jesus that we stopped paying attention to Jesus. And that's really a sad thing. I love the fact that you picked the heart of worship, because the whole backstory to Matt Redman's song is that he was rising in his fame, really, with leading worship. People were flocking to hear him, and he was putting on a performance and putting on a show until it all kind of came crashing down around him. And he just said, we're coming back to the heart of worship. And sometimes we need that, don't we? We get so consumed with doing the good things, doing the right things, doing the things that we feel called to do, and we lose sight of Jesus. And that's what's happening with Martha. The issue isn't that we're doing the wrong thing. Sometimes the issue is that too many good things are pulling our hearts in too many different directions. That's the definition of distraction in this passage. Distracted by many things. Our culture has turned distraction into a way of life. It's easy to become distracted, not by terrible things or sinful things, but by things that could actually be good. The phone vibrates, email arrives, texts appear, headlines change, constantly checking the news. The next video begins automatically. That drives me crazy, right? I've got to go home and figure out how to turn that off. Someone needs something. Something needs fixing. Something needs answering. Something needs planning. Something needs worrying about. And none of these things necessarily seem wrong in and of themselves. And that's what makes distraction so powerful. Some of you know, of course, that I went on a motorcycle trip. I'll try not to weave this into every sermon. But here's one more story from our trip that we went into Idaho and Montana. And we met this couple. I talked about them and the friendship we had. We met them, traveled with them for several days, and camped together and ate our meals together. And it ended up being the best part of the trip, even though I resisted it. I didn't want it to happen. I wanted to be alone with my wife in the wilderness. And this couple came along, and they were fantastic. The wife, Leslie, very competent rider, but she was learning some of her slow speed skills. And when you're on a motorbike in gravel and dirt roads and dirt tracks, there's a lot of things going on. Everything in your body is busy, right? There's something for your left hand and something for your right hand, something for your left foot and something for your right foot. And you're balancing this 500-pound machine with all your gear, and some of us are packing a little extra gear as we get on the bike. And so it's a lot to manage. And we happen to find ourselves, once again, slightly lost. We lost our track, and we're coming down this narrow gravel road and realize we need to stop and turn around. And here's the thing, there's no guardrails, there's no, and there's just drop-offs that go, because these are old logging roads sometimes. And as we came up to the edge of the road, Leslie was in front of me, and all of a sudden I saw her as she was trying to park her bike. She looked down at the big valley below, and she fell over. Off her bike, rolled off the cliff. And I yelled into our intercom, she's down, she's down, she's down, and park my bike and go running back. And thankfully, Jesus had planted some trees. And what you see in that little helmet there, that's Leslie down there. Now, I took the picture after we made sure she was safe, just so you know. I wasn't like, oh no! And I wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. She asked me to take the picture, right? After we determined that she wasn't going to go further down this, and you can't really see it there, the steep embankment, she only fell about 15 feet down. And after we determined that, we were like, we have to document this a little bit before we figure out how to get her bike up and haul her out. We're very thankful that she wasn't injured. What happened? What happened to poor Leslie as she was coming up, and all the different things, all the busyness of trying to park this motorcycle on the side of the road? She looked the wrong way, and she went toward that to which she was looking. That's target fixation. And it happens, right? We tend to go to the place that we're looking at. And I think this is relevant to this whole conversation about distraction, because it wasn't that Martha was doing wrong things. There was lots of things that had to be done, but she had lost her focus on the one thing, on the right thing. Most of us aren't pulled away from Jesus by obviously terrible things. We're pulled away by the many things. And Jesus says this to Martha, you're worried about the many, many things. So, how do we eliminate the many things? Well, we don't. Martha still has a house full of guests. Dinner still needs to be served. Tomorrow morning still comes. So the better question perhaps is this: how do I attend to the many things without losing sight of the one thing? That's what we want to ask ourselves as we go through and wrap this up today. One thing is needed. This is what Jesus says. Few things are needed, or indeed only one, and Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. What's the one thing? Well, I don't think Jesus is prescribing a particular devotional technique. He's not simply saying you should sit more in solitude, or you should read your Bible longer, or you should attend services and become more... He's not suggesting a program of behavior. The one thing is Jesus himself. And that's very important and helpful for us, I think. Mary has centered her attention on Jesus. She is receiving before doing. She's listening before speaking, and being with Jesus before doing something for Jesus is so important. And Mary has found it. Before Jesus says go, he says come. Before there is service, there is grace. And the problem with distraction is it quietly reverses that order for us. makes us want to do first and listen later. And that's the recipe for just distraction and disruption. We can become so consumed with everything we need to do that we forget the one that we're called to follow. So we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. You know the verse in Hebrews chapter 12? It tells us another way of understanding this. The author says this, "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus." Notice he doesn't say, stop running. No, you got to keep on running. You got to keep doing the things that need to be done. The race is still on. There's still work to do. But the invitation is this, that while we're running, we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, fixed on the most important part. So here's maybe 3 quick things that we can do to help keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. First of all, we need to notice what is pulling us, what is drawing our attention. Martha's problem begins with being pulled in many directions. So maybe we need to ask, what has my attention right now? What occupies my thoughts when I wake up? That, for me, is the biggest telltale sign of what's pulling at my heart. What occupies my thoughts as soon as I get out of bed? I have this terrible habit, and I'm trying to break it, honestly. But when I get out of bed, I grab my phone and I check my work emails and to see who I need to respond to that day. And it's terrible. None of you need a response at 6 a.m., I hope. Right? Right? And so I don't need to do that. And I got to say, is that what's drawing my heart? Maybe I need to get up in the morning and just pray the Lord's Prayer. Maybe I need to roll out of bed and just say, thank you, Jesus, for another day. And maybe I need to just recenter my thoughts simply and intentionally before I start scrolling through the news or scrolling through email. And so that's one way to notice what's pulling at our hearts, is when we wake up in the morning, what's the first things that come to mind, and be intentional about directing our thoughts toward Jesus. Here's a second thing maybe we can do, is to listen before we react or act. Mary sat at the Lord's feet listening, and there's something incredibly countercultural about listening. We don't have to respond immediately to everything. Every notification isn't an emergency, and this is really important for us, I think, in the age of social media. Every opinion doesn't require our response. We get some of the Facebook warriors, social media warriors, right? And they come across someone's opinion that is really just stirs them up, and you just got to give a response. We don't. We don't. We don't even have to have an opinion about certain things. Sometimes, I remember there was a family member trying to engage me in a conversation, and I knew it was heading in a direction where that particular person wanted to make a point. And thankfully, something in me just said, you know what? I don't have an opinion about it. I don't know enough to have an opinion. It's okay to say that. It's okay then just to listen. What do you have to say? What is your opinion on the matter? To listen before we react. Every opportunity isn't necessarily our assignment. The need isn't always the call. And so sometimes discipleship means become quiet enough to simply ask this question, Jesus, what are you saying to me in this moment? What are you saying to me? What are you teaching me in this moment? Well, here's the third thing, and as we wrap up. Third thing maybe we can do to fight against distraction and to have that focus is simply this, to choose the one thing again. It's a choice. Jesus says, Martha has chosen what is better. This whole story isn't about two personality types and we're automatically one or the other. It's about a choice. And the choice that Mary made was better. Attention involves choice. We don't accidentally become attentive to Jesus. Again and again, we need to turn our attention to him. It's like being married, right? Marriage and love together is a choice. It's a daily choice, right? And we need to make that choice. It's the same in our relationship with Jesus. We need to choose to pay attention. We choose again to say, Jesus, you are the center. Whatever else is happening today, all the different tasks that I have to do, I'm going to keep my eyes fixed on you. That doesn't necessarily mean leaving the kitchen. It may mean returning to the kitchen with a different heart. And I think that's maybe what Jesus wanted for Mary. Sacred attention. Perhaps this is what Jesus is offering in all of this. Not an escape from responsibility, but freedom within the responsibility. Not a life without work, but rather a life centered on Christ while we work. Not a life without many things, a life in which the many things are ordered around the one thing. And I think that's the bottom line in this story. Because the sacred ordinary isn't about adding more religious activity to our already crowded lives. It's about discovering Jesus in the life that we're already living. And that's so important. So when we eat, we do it for the glory of God. When we work at it with all our heart for the Lord. With our friends, we lay down our lives. And when the ordinary demands of life begin pulling us in 100 directions as they do, we fix our eyes on Jesus. This is how we walk in the ordinary things in the mundane. So maybe the question carry into this week, and here's my challenge for us for this week, is this. What is pulling me away from Jesus this week? And what would it look like to give him my attention again? There will always be many things, good things, necessary things, even important things, but in the middle of those things, Jesus says, there is this one thing that is needed. So the goal isn't to become less responsible, it's become less distracted, and to work without losing sight of Jesus, to serve without losing sight of Jesus, to care for others without losing sight of Jesus. You see where this is going, right? To live our ordinary lives with our attention centered around Jesus. Because perhaps one of the most sacred things we can give God in a distracted world is simply this, our attention.